Thank you really to the BEO for organizing this event. It's so nice to have educational aspect to Basque community functions, and for people who are Basque to be able to manifest their Basqueness in an academic way or in an educational way, and just a place where we can get together and discuss topics and to learn about ourselves and about others. So thank you very much for the work that's been done. I applaud you. I really appreciate everything. The topic is kind of all-encompassing because it is the diaspora. When we talk about diaspora, this is what we mean. This is how we define diaspora. A group of people, when we talk about the Basques as a diaspora, then we're talking about a group of people that have these elements. Maybe not every single one of these elements, and in some cases, in some different communities, certain of these elements are more important than the others. But in general, we share these things. We have a dispersal from the Basque country. We have a dispersal from the original 7 provinces. We have an expansion. We've gone in search of work and trade as part of the Spanish colonization, as part of French colonization of other lands. And just for economic reasons, for political exile, as war refugees, we've left our homeland. And we have spread now into 21 different countries. In a diaspora population in general, you also have kind of this idealization of the homeland, because often people are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation later, they've never been there, and the only knowledge that they have of the homeland, of the Basque country, is what they've heard from their parents, what they've heard from their grandparents, and generally that's all the good stuff. And so then all the good stuff gets even more flowery, and it becomes unrealistic. But that's typical. That's just human nature. Our collective memory and myth about the homeland and a movement to return. And today what I'm going to argue is that a return to the homeland doesn't need to be a physical return. We don't need to physically move back to Euskaleria to stay. We can have virtual returns like this. You're getting your ethnic batteries charged today, and you're filling up with Basqueness, and we need that. As human beings sometimes. We need to share with other people, because ethnic identity is a collective thing. It's not as meaningful, it's not as fulfilling if you're doing it by yourself, watching, clicking on websites on the internet, as it is to come here and stay for dinner tonight, stay for the dance, etc., or to have a discussion with different people. So we have an ethnic group consciousness that's sustained over time. We're talking about 5 centuries of Basques in South America that go as part of the colonization. Many diasporas have a troubled relationship with their homeland. In the Basque case, we don't have any examples of troubled relationships between Basques and the host countries that they've gone to Argentina, to Uruguay, to Chile, to the Philippines, to Canada, to Australia, to Belgium, because in general, Basques are white Christians who have migrated to countries where the majority is white and Christian. And so there hasn't been any kind of a serious religious conflict, and also they've tried to blend in or they've separated themselves out for certain things, but they haven't made any claims on government. They haven't tried to get any kind of special recognition or special attention or any kind of special programs. A definite sense of solidarity with co-ethnic members in other countries. And we're going to talk today about this worldwide Basque diaspora and creating an enriching life in tolerance in the host societies. This is our Basque diaspora today. We have about 160 different Basque organizations that are registered associations in their host country, and or they've contacted the Basque government and have registered with the autonomous Basque government. And so about 148 of those have begun to participate in interrelationships with each other. They participate in the World Congress of Basque collectivities that we have once every 4 years. They send emails to each other. They send dancing groups to, they do exchanges of dancing groups, of pelotaris, of academics, etc. And so what we have is basically a situation where today globalization is helping us, because this supposedly new world-scale reality is not really new for Basques. We've been doing this for centuries with trade, with Basques who used each other for trade to help get connections and to help create networks. And so when we talk about today's globalization and intensity and speed and permeability of globalization, for us in the Basque diaspora, it's not really anything new. It's just more intense, and it's easier. It's facilitated by telecommunications. The institutions that we have here create a Basque civic society inside the diaspora. We have two identities, at least. We have a U.S. identity. I'm very proud to live in this country, because this country has facilitated for my parents, who are immigrants from Guernica, it has facilitated incredible liberties for speech, for self-expression, for education, for economic advancement. And so I'm very proud to be an American. I'm also very proud to be Basque. And it doesn't have to be a hierarchy. You don't have to be more Basque than American or more American than Basque. You can be both at the same time, because they're different kinds of identity. Being an American is a civic identity. It's physically where I live. It's a territorial identity. But my Basqueness is not a territorial identity. I don't have to be in the Basque country to feel, to think, to sing. Okay, so an ethnic identity is a different kind of an identity, and that's what we have now in these Basque centers. When we talk about the Basque diaspora, we're talking about immigration. And basically in the early 1800s, thousands of Basques escaped French and Spanish persecution for having fought usually on the losing sides of wars and revolutions. And the majority of these immigrants departed in the early 1800s for Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. Earlier, they would have gone to Mexico, to Colombia, to Peru, to Bolivia. In Iparralde, those people also who fought on losing sides of wars and or tried to escape military service were persecuted, themselves and their families. Their names were put on lists and posted around towns and around the other provinces, and people would look for these missing persons, and they could be imprisoned, they could be killed, actually, for not serving the French government. In Spain, it was the same situation. We have in the 1870s the Carlist Wars, in the 1830s, and then again in the 1870s, and both times the Basques fought on the losing side. And so with wars come war reparations, and poverty, and famine, and political exile. And so Basques had to leave. So many of the Basques that leave at the end of the 1800s are political exiles. And a lot of times in our communities we say, well, we're not political, we don't get involved in politics. When the reality is, that was the reason for a lot of people's immigration. That was the reason that started these people having to leave the Basque country in the thousands. Okay? And there are many excellent studies, for example, from Iparralde, where a town maybe within a 2-decade period had maybe 40% of its population depleted to immigration. Argentina and Uruguay sent agents to the Basque country to try to get people to immigrate. They wanted people from the Basque country, and they had offices in Lapurdi, they had offices in Chiverua, and they specifically tried to get Basque people to go to Uruguay, to go to Argentina. In the American West, the immigration has been different. And we see it today in the we see it today in the Basque centers that we have. Generations later, many of the people that came to the American West at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s were economic exiles. And they came from poverty-stricken areas in Chiverua, in Nafarroa, and in Vizcaya. They were manual laborers, and many were illiterate. While the others who had gone to South America many times were businessmen. They were the educated. They were the politicians. So we have a difference already in the kinds of people that immigrate and where they immigrate to. In the American West, the majority of people who immigrate to the United States at the end of the 1800s and during the 1900s are manual laborers. Okay? They are not political exiles, and then that affects their communities and how interested or not interested they were in politics in general. There was sometimes information on the West Coast about what was happening in Europe, but generally not. Maybe from a San Francisco newspaper. They might get some news about Great Britain or France, but almost nothing about Spain. So not only were these Basques spread sparsely across the West, so they didn't have a lot of contact with each other necessarily, but they also did not have a lot of regular institutional contact with the homeland. They were not getting newspaper information. They were not getting the data that maybe Basques in New York were getting, or that Basques in South America were getting. By the late 1920s in Spain, Spain had suffered another dictatorship, and again, thousands of Basques departed. And many of these political activists went to New York or to South America. Again, mostly Chile, Argentina, Uruguay. But again, the Basques of the American West remained relatively isolated from each other and from political action. Basque nationalism began serious attempts to gain a separate autonomous government in the homeland at the end of the 1920s, and the elected democratic Spanish Republican Parliament finally approved Basque autonomy on October 1st, 1936. So when people ask, has there ever been a separate Basque state? Well, first of all, we say yes, there was a Kingdom of Navarra, okay, for centuries. Then we could also argue yes. In 1936, 3 provinces of the Basque Country did have autonomy. They were granted political autonomy in October 1936. However, if you think of history for a second, it's October 1936, and the Spanish Civil War began in July of 1936. So we've got a problem. We have a beginning autonomous government, and the first thing that they have to do is to get themselves organized to fight a war, okay, because they're already involved in the Spanish Civil War. Navarra did not participate in this autonomy. The people of Navarra had not voted in high enough percentages, and the rules in Spain for autonomy were that they had to reach a certain percent in all the towns, and they didn't reach it. They voted no. So it was just Araba, Vizcaya, and Gipuzkoa who formed part of that autonomous government. So they met in Guernica at the Casa de Juntas, and they swore in, they elected José Antonio de Aguirre as the first president of the autonomous Basque community, and he was sworn in Guernica during the war. So this was the first president of the Basque government. They had to get going, obviously. Okay, they're being attacked. The first order of business was organizing for the war against Franco. They had absolutely no experience in doing such a thing. They had to organize an army, and these were the basic volunteers that they worked with. People showed up in their suits because they were proud of what they were doing. And so you wore your best clothes to represent the Basque provinces, not your work clothes. You wore your best clothes. They came in their suits, they came in their best shoes, and that was their uniform. The Basque government then had to also organize for an evacuation because of the bombings in Gipuzkoa, the bombings in Vizcaya. Franco's military was aided by the Germans and by the Italians. And so the Germans were trying out some of their new aircraft, and they needed to practice. And there were deals, there were military agreements between the Franco-led military and the Germans to be able to use the Basque provinces and to be able to use the Spanish Civil War for practice targeting. It was also the first time that incendiary bombs were used against civilian targets ever in the history of human warfare. An incendiary bomb is different than a regular explosive. An incendiary bomb the purpose of it is to set fire. So it wasn't only to destroy something, it was then also to burn everything else down. So the Spanish Civil War and the Basque government then, and their relations with the diaspora are very emotional, very important today still, because we have not forgot this. These are our parents. This is our parents' generation. This is some of your generation. Some of us, it's our grandparents' generation. The Basque government had to find safe havens for the war refugees. There were 150,000 Basques from the Spanish side that crossed the border and went into Iparralde. And it's because of the Basques in Iparralde that those people are alive and that those families were saved. It's incredible when you think of Iparralde and a total population. Today, the total population is only about 300,000. So if you think in times of emergency and all of a sudden thousands and thousands of people are crossing the border, and who's going to take care of them? They did, and they didn't ask any questions either. The doors were opened. They're Basque. They're coming from the south. They need help. There's a war. This is a crisis. And these are the kinds of children that they received also. 30,000 children that were either orphaned or were traveling without their parents went to Iparralde first, where the Basque government in exile organized where they would be sent, and they tried to find families for them. And those children were then sent on. Some of them were in the other parts of France, in the northern part of France, and then they went to the Soviet Union, they went to Mexico, they went to Belgium, they went to Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland. And this was quite an operation. This is how the Basque government had to start. This is the initiation process. The Basque government was intent upon making sure that these kids that traveled, if at all possible, went with a Basque priest, a Basque teacher, somebody from their town, if at all possible. And then when they emptied these hospitals, they tried to send a nurse or a doctor that could speak Basque with these kids, because you can imagine the trauma of war, the trauma of injury, and then on top of that, they're going to take you away from where your parents and away from everything you know and take you to another country where no one is going to say anything to you that you understand. They're not going to speak any language that you understand. And for a child, obviously, that would be an incredible crisis, an incredible crisis. So this is part of our identity also. This is part of, when we talk about diaspora relations, who received these children and who took care of them. And we have to remember that if it had not been for those Basques in Iparralde, thousands and thousands of Basques from the Spanish side, from the southern side, would not have made it. They wouldn't have had anywhere to go. Once they crossed into Iparralde, then they went generally to Venezuela, to Mexico, and on to exile in other places. The news coverage of the Spanish Civil War was extensive, and immigrants received news from numerous local newspapers. It was much better by then, okay? The Spanish Civil War is 1936 to 1939, and there is much evidence of communications in South American Basque communities and in New York, but very little in the American West. All of these different provinces in the Basque country had literally hundreds of newspapers that they were printing and that they were mailing out, and that relatives would send to their family members wherever they were, to their immigrant family members. But what we see is that, again, in the South American countries and the South American communities and in New York, the information is much more prevalent. So in those communities, there's a much stronger political understanding of the Basque provinces. There's a much stronger interest in politics in general. I've done a lot of field work, and I've done field work in South America since 1986. And so I've traveled in these communities and done a lot of interviews and a lot of questionnaires and just a lot of discussions. And I've also, gone through their libraries and gone through their personal libraries. And so what I do is keep track. What kinds of information do they have about the Civil War? What kinds of information do they have about the Basque country? And it is much, much more prevalent in the South American countries. In the United States, we have a very, a really sad situation regarding the Spanish Civil War and the Basque orphan children. The only Basque center in the United States that attempted to accept any of the Spanish Civil War orphan children or their exiles was the Centro Vasco Americano of New York. Today it's called the Euskal Etxea of New York. No Basque communities from anywhere else in the United States agreed to help receive any refugee families. At that time, in the West, the American communities were not necessarily organized by institutions. The closest thing we would have had to institutions would have been the boarding houses that we heard about this morning. But it is interesting that there was no concerted effort from the American West to try to receive any of these refugees or to help in any way to receive any of these orphan children. When a State Department commission in Washington, D.C. decided to allow entrance visas for 500 Basque children, they did at one point say, okay, yes, we'll take 500 of these orphans. 3,500 families from New York signed up immediately. And so then they said, well, okay, if we've got 3,500 people who are saying yes, well, we'll up it. Okay, we'll accept 1,000. And then the United States Catholic Church intervened, and they labeled the Basques as fighting against Franco, and therefore must be anti-Catholic, and therefore communist. And then the United States government changed its policy, and they refused asylum to these Basque children. And it was within about 8 days of when they were going to leave from the port of Le Havre. They had gone into Iparralde already. They were going to go by train north, and they were getting ready. They thought they were leaving. The families in New York thought that they were going to be accepting children and that they would be helping these families. And then the United States government, the State Department, shut it down, assuming that, again, these children could be, I don't know, pretty dangerous, I guess. They thought that accepting these children would be really dangerous. In England, this is a Basque orphan children refugee camp in Southampton in England. The children lived in these tents for nearly 4 years in Southampton. The British government refused to allow families to take in the supposedly communist Basque children into their actual homes. They could be dangerous. Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, Uruguay, Chile, the Soviet Union, Britain, Belgium, Switzerland, Denmark, and France all accepted war refugees in one form or another. The United States never did, and in England they lived either in boarding schools or in some kind of a dormitory where they were separated from everyone else, and or in these camps and in these tents. In Denmark, they were actually sent to an island. The only access to the island was by a ferry, because again, they were defined as communist and as anti-Catholic. And many of you who are part of this community know that I can't think of any other definition that would be, more off base than anti-Catholic. But that's how they were defined, and it served its purpose. The Basque government in exile then had to go in, or the Basque government had to go into exile after the fall of Bilbao. The Spanish nationalists forced the Basque government into exile to Barcelona and to Paris. So they divided their offices after Bilbao was taken over by the Spanish forces. So part of the cabinet went to Barcelona, the other part went to Paris. And then with the military fall of Catalonia, the Basque government moved all of its operations to Paris. In 1938, okay, the war is from 1936 to 1939. So in 1938, what the Basque government did was organize delegations in all of these different communities, especially around South America, where there were these Basque communities. And they were trying to investigate the possibilities of having the Basque centers, having these Euskal-Etxeak, serve as some kind of reception centers for all this Basque immigration. Because by 1938, there was already about 100,000 people that had left the Basque country and were in Iparralde. And from Iparralde needed to go someplace. I mean, Iparralde, they were the Red Cross. They were the Basque Red Cross, really. The emergency, all the urgent care, everything there. Then many of them chose to move on to Venezuela, to Argentina, to Uruguay. And so what the Basque government tried to do was then, in those Basque communities, set up receiving committees and organize it so that there would be families there when those children came or when those families came. And so again, they had fantastic receptions in New York and in the South American countries, and no response from the American West Basques. So nothing out here from Idaho, Oregon, California, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, basically no response. From New York in 1937, the Basque government delegation to the United States, they actually visited Boise, Idaho, and they were trying to kind of measure what kind of help might we get from Boise, Idaho? They were putting out, in these other delegations, they were actually putting out bulletins trying to educate people. Look, we're not anti-Catholic, we're not communist, we're Basque, and we have an autonomous statute. This is what we stand for. This is our history, our culture, our tradition. But it was kind of falling on deaf ears. It wasn't as successful. When they went to Boise, they didn't get any response either. They physically went to Boise. The delegates went to Boise, Idaho, and the letter that the delegate wrote to the president of the Basque country, the Lendakari, was that he said this: there's a lack of national consciousness, and their mentality in regards to patriotism is American, not Basque. So they gave up on the West. They had an office in Boise for about it was actually about 7 weeks. And they closed shop. Said, people here are not responding. We've given them all the information about the orphans. We're giving them the information about the war and these exiles and these terrible things that are happening. And we're not getting any help. And we are in New York. So forget it. Let's go back to New York where we know it's going to be successful. At the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, then within just a short period of time, we have World War II begins. So we have all these refugees, we have all these people that are now in Iparralde and have kind of gone farther north and into France, and then the Nazis overrun Paris and Iparralde. So the Basque government is caught in France and in Iparralde, and members of the Basque government are sent to the concentration camps at Gurs. Okay, and so this is actually a Basque choir that they formed at the concentration camp at Gurs. And many of the people that were here and part of this choir were delegates of the Basque government in exile and other Basque nationalists who had been bombed out of their homes in Vizcaya or Gipuzkoa or Nafarroa, had made it into what they thought was a safe haven in Iparralde, and then a few years later they're overrun by the Nazis, and then they end up in a prisoner of war camp in Gurs in France. So the Basque government in exile then moves to London, and then also the delegates move the Basque government in exile head office to New York, because that's where they're getting a response, and obviously New York is the center of the world for many things, including media attention, politics, getting information out. And so the president of the Basque government, Aguirre, is actually offered a job at Columbia University in Manhattan. And so besides being president of a government in exile, he's also writing lectures for his history courses and grading student papers. It's incredible, okay? He was there from 1941 to 1946. So the Basque government in exile utilized its base in New York as its central office for the relations with the U.S. government and later with the United Nations. And so Aguirre was actually held in very high regard. The Basques were held with much status and much self-esteem, and at the beginning, the Basque government did side with the U.S. government did side with the Basques. Okay, they understood that the Franco regime was a dictatorship. They were a little bit nervous about the Basque and their connection during the Civil War, and where did they get armaments? Well, the Soviet Union had sent some armaments. Anarchists had participated. Other left-wing governments in Central Europe had helped with military equipment and with basically humanitarian aid, sending shoes and blankets. And to the United States, that was just a little bit scary, going too far to the left. And so there was a good relationship. However, it was always tentative. Okay, it was always up for change, as a matter of fact. In New York, then the Basques printed this bulletin. The Basque delegation printed this bulletin. And Irene Renteria Aguirre, many of you remember her. She was one of our NAVO delegates from New York for many years, was hired as a personal secretary to the president of the Basque country. And so she worked for 8 years in that Basque delegation in New York. And her knowledge of Basque, of Spanish, of English, of business management, really together with her understanding of U.S. politics, New York and the New York power players, plus her understanding of European politics and how things work in the Basque country and how Basque mentality, really made her an absolutely indispensable expert for the Basque government. And then Andoni Aguirre, many of you will remember him as another NABO delegate from New York, actually arrived in New York in 1945 from the Philippines. And he was hired by the Basque government as a commercial attaché, and later he and Irene married. They met together at that Basque government in exile office. In New York, the Basque delegation, besides publishing and trying to get information out to the politicians, out to the Catholic Church, etc., also took donations. And what they did was they tried to contact as many people as possible in the Basque communities and asked them to make donations for the war reparations in the Basque country. Okay, to try and send food, to try and send old clothing, old shoes, blankets, pots and pans, anything. And I was very fortunate to be able to do fieldwork in New York with many Basque families, and the stories that they tell of, boxing up just anything. Sometimes what they were left with was the worst stuff, and when something new was purchased, it got sent to some family member in Baguio, or it got sent to a family member in Pamplona. So the connections between the Basque communities, again, have always been there. Maybe they haven't been institutionalized, but they've been there. And in New York especially, there's a political understanding for that. So they raised funds for the children and the civilian victims of war, basically from these delegations around South America and especially in New York. And so each person had this card, and every month they would send in their quota. They would send in whatever their donation was, whatever their pledge had been. And some people pledged 25 cents a month because that's what they could afford. But they did it every month. And then other people that I interviewed remembered that they would have dances, and the kids, if they had a nickel or if they had a quarter or something that they'd got from whatever, they got to donate that. And the adults, made them feel really important and made them understand how important it was. So since these people have been children, they have been part of a political identity that in the American West is lacking. It just hasn't been there. It just has not been a part of the Basque in the West mentality or part of their reality. Later, in the 70s, then, Basque in the U.S. West did pay a little more attention to homeland politics when finally the U.S. media started covering the Franco regime's repeated abuses of human and civil rights, such as with the Burgos trials and the death penalty trials for 16 people that were accused of collaboration with ETA. So when the issue of Basque centers' political activities is raised, it's important to note that the majority of centers were extremely significant to the Basque government in exile and its delegations during those 40 years of dictatorship. I've conducted work in these countries, and over and over again, they don't understand why we don't get it. They always ask me that. Yeah, but okay, you're Basque. Okay, yeah, but where are you from? Boise, Idaho. Okay, well, you're one of those ones that, it's like, well, okay, I'm not, but they don't understand why we don't understand. But it's because in the West, we just did not have that experience. So in Argentina, when they think of relations with the Basque government, what they visualize and what they feel and what they think is completely different than what Basques in the American West talk about. A lot of times here, if you say relations with the Basque government, what's the first thing that you think of? Dollar signs, right? Grant money. A visit from the president, we'll have a bunch of chistularis and hello, goodbye, thank you very much, next. And that's not how it is in these other countries, because there's a century or more of serious relations with homeland institutions. Okay, and we have to remember that. When we participate in these world congresses, when we participate in exchanges with other Basque communities, we have to remember their reality is different than ours. Their, what we call institutional memory, is different than ours, because theirs includes a very thick dose of political reality that we are lacking. Today's Spain, after Franco died in 1975, in 1978 there was a new Spanish constitution that was proposed and accepted. And so this new Spanish constitution allows for both. It tried to offer a solution, really, to the demands for self-government, while at the same time trying to retain centralist elements. So it's in a way similar to the United States, where we have a national government in Washington, D.C. that makes certain laws that all of the country has to follow, and then we have 50 states, and each one of those states can make their own rules and their own laws. It's similar to that. In Spain, there is a national government in Madrid, and there are certain laws and rules that only the national government in Madrid can pass. But simultaneously, there are 17 autonomous regions. And in those 17 autonomous regions, they have different rules and different programs and different projects that they can pass. The difference between the United States setup and the Spanish setup is that it's not the same in every one of these autonomous regions like it is in the United States. Idaho has the same kinds of powers as California through our state legislatures. In Spain, it's different. The Basque country has many, many more powers than some of these other autonomous regions, okay, because they were negotiated as part of the statutes of autonomy. So each one of these regions negotiated their own regional constitution with Madrid as a part of their statutes of autonomy. So today, what we have for the Basque country, we have Araba, Vizcaya, and Gipuzkoa, who approved their statutes of autonomy for what's now called Euskadi. And this is another thing we have to think about is titles and what we call these places. Politically and administratively, when we say Euskadi today, it means only Vizcaya, Gipuzkoa, and Araba, because they chose that name, they chose that title for their autonomous community. Okay, and so they have their own rules. They created their parliament in March 1980. Nafarroa achieved a separate autonomy. Just like in the 30s, they didn't want to go with the other three provinces. They wanted to go it alone. So they negotiated a separate autonomy, and they have their own separate constitution. And so they are known as the Foral, F-O-R-A-L, the Foral Community of Nafarroa. And so they have their own rules and regulations in their own parliament, etc. And then in Iparralde, we've got another completely different situation, because in Iparralde's political administrative unit, there's this other section out there that isn't Basque, the Béarn. And so we have really the Basque country divided into three different political administrative units. Okay? In Euskadi, okay, then in the regional governments on the Spanish side, this is how things work. Okay, going from the bottom there, it says members elected directly by universal suffrage. The people vote for their legislature. Okay, we'll call it the regional assembly. In the Basque country, it's called the parliament, the Basque parliament. Okay, so the people get a vote for that person. Then the parliament selects the president. Okay, and he's called a president. In other countries, it's called a prime minister or a premier. But the regular voters never actually vote for their chief executive. There's a filter. There's a legislative branch filter. Okay? Then that president goes over and appoints these people. The regional executives, the government departments, they don't have to be people from the parliament, but they usually are. But it's not a requirement. Okay? So partisan politics is very important in the homeland. And when we ask diaspora Basques about partisan politics and what do you know, do any of you know the difference between the PNV and EA? Do you know the difference between Izquierda Unida and the Partido Popular? In the research that I've done, in the questionnaires I've asked you, and in the interviews when I've asked you, about a third of you say that you do. And then when I've asked you to explain it to me, about a half of that third can actually explain it to me. But it's very, very small percentage that actually really understand homeland politics. What happens if I vote for that party? Or when there were the last elections, oh, the Partido Popular won. What does that mean? Most of us don't. Most of us in the American West don't know. If we go to New York, it's a different story. And when we go to South America, it's another different story. So this is the Basque government and how the Basque government functions. When I say Basque government, meaning the Basque government of Euskadi, okay, of just those three provinces, Araba, Vizcaya, and Gipuzkoa. In the 1980s, in the office of the presidency of the Basque government, they established this office for dealing with the Basque collectivities, they call them, the best communities in the diaspora. And so you can see here, I don't know if you can see there or not, maybe you can't, it's at the very bottom, how much money they're willing to put into this. And when we look at the Directorate of Relations with Basque collectivities, for us, these are the 2002 figures. It's about $1,500,000. Okay, so about $1.5 million. This year for 2003, it's about $800,000. Okay, so because we keep adding Basque centers, we keep adding to the number of Basque centers, but the Basque budget is not necessarily increasing because we're adding these new Basque centers. They're putting money in different other things. So actually, when we talk about relations with the Basque government and grant monies, that grant money is not necessarily always going to be there. And the amounts won't be the same either. And they might begin to say, well, no, we want it for certain projects. Or you're going to have to complete A, B, and C to get this money. And if you don't get a grant. They haven't put any strings to this money yet. But that doesn't mean that they won't in the future. This is the kind of money that we're talking about so that you can see a comparison between countries. And I've got 2000 and 2001 in here just because in 2002 and 2003 things changed. They had a World Congress, and so they had to change the figures. They had to change the amount of money that was going here and there for different projects. But you can see that obviously Argentina, when we talk about Argentina, Argentina currently, as of last week actually, has 84 Basque, what we would call a Basque center. They have 84 different Basque organizations, okay? And so obviously a large amount of money is going to go there. But the USA does pretty well. And then you see that in some of these smaller countries, maybe they're not getting as much money, but it might be just because they're not applying. Some of these Basque centers don't want to apply for this money. They say there's no such thing as a free lunch. If we take this money now, in the future, they're going to come back and they're going to start campaigning, or they're going to tell us to vote for this, that, or the other. They're going to ask for something. That's the American West mentality. And in these other countries where they have this 100 years of relationship, and also in New York where it's a different idea and a different relationship, they don't have those worries, and they don't think about it that way. But in the American West, they do tend to ask those questions here in our NABO meetings. In Nafarroa, there's really no relationship between the Basque government in Nafarroa with the diaspora. Obviously, it depends on who or which political party is in charge, right? But since their statutes of autonomy in 1982 were passed, they have not created any kind of specific institutional relations with any of us in the United States. In Argentina, there are 5 Basque centers that are just for Nafarroans. Okay, they are the Centro Vasco de Nafarroa, or they're the Centro Navarro. And so your ancestry has to be from Nafarroa to join that center. Okay, so recently, because of the financial situation in Argentina, the government of Nafarroa has signed agreements to send humanitarian aid to the Basque centers that are the Nafarroan Basque centers in Argentina, only for those Nafarroans who are members of those centers, but not for any of the other Basque centers and not for any other Argentinians either. You have to be a registered member of that center, and about 2 weeks ago they sent the equivalent of about $60,000 US in medicines. And then they're saying that maybe in January and February they'll send something else. But other than that, there are no institutional relations that are permanent relations at all. On the north side in Iparralde, in 1982, French law established administrative decentralization of political power, which is the first time in centuries, really since the French Revolution. And so a new phase of administrative decentralization, again, was intensified just now in March of 2003. The president called a meeting, a special session, really, of the 2 chambers of the French Parliament, and they passed a reform of the Constitution, granting to local authorities, mainly the departments and the regions, jurisdiction and responsibilities that were previously held by the central government in Paris. Okay, who cares? We do, because powers that used to be taken care of in Paris And decisions that used to only be made in Paris can now be made in the smaller local governments. And so in the Basque area, okay, which is currently in the region of Aquitaine, if we look at just the Basque areas, then local councils are going to have more political power. And what's also very important is that we're talking about 10 billion euros, which is a little bit more than $10 billion of a French budget that could be taken away from Paris and a central government, a central parliament, and divided down to the regions. That means that we can have euskera classes. That means that we can change educational curriculum in the Basque Country. That means that there can be a lot of changes in street signs, in simple things like that. They can promote Basque culture, promote Basque language, promote a Basque identity instead of a French identity, if that's what people vote for and if that's what they want. So today in France, there are 22 regions. There are about 100 of these smaller units that are called departments. And now is when we get into what's happening in Iparralde as far as a political movement is concerned. In Iparralde, there is a movement to create their own department and to just separate from Bern and have their own separate political department that would then have these powers and would have control over these budgets. So in March of 2003, the Parliament agreed to these things. The French Parliament in Paris agreed to decentralization, the power going down to these local units. And so they're going to focus on these, basically these four things. They're stressing the organization of the French Republic as hereby decentralized, that laws and regulations can contain new and what they call experimental measures, which means that they're open to change. They talk about the possibility of territorial authority calling referendum now, which is brand new. Usually Paris, the national parliament has to call for a local referendum. They have to okay it. And now they're talking about local areas being able to do that themselves. And then the last one's the most important for us in the diaspora. The overseas populations within the French people are recognized in a shared ideal of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And so maybe they're getting ready for relations with the diaspora, because those are the kinds of words that they're using. When we talk about nationalism in Iparralde now, you can see an incredible growth and drastic changes taking place in the last few years. In '99, the first time that they had a march in Bayona in favor of creating a Basque department, they had about 6,000 people show up, which was fantastic. They were ecstatic. But just a few months later, when they did the same thing, 13,000 people came and marched in favor of creating their own separate department. In a 1999 poll that was done actually by a university, and so we can assume that it wasn't just somebody trying to get the answers that they wanted, this poll showed that 67% of the people in Iparralde favor some kind of a separate Basque department. So if we put that together with the idea that they can call for a referenda, and maybe they can call for a referenda to have a separate department, and if 67% of the people look to be in favor of it, then there's a possibility that there could be serious and very important, very significantly political change in the Basque Country. In the last elections, the Nationalist Party won 12% of the vote, which sounds really pitiful, but in this case it's the highest percentage they've ever won. And so they've got momentum going and things are getting better. Things are not getting worse, things are getting better. It was the highest approval rating. And the last shows the report, the United Nations UNESCO report declaring that if in the Basque Country something is not done yesterday, they have declared basically probable death for euskera in those provinces. Because there are no institutions, and because we don't have a Basque government in Iparralde to deal with, we've got to find something else. We've got to find someone else. And this is a likely candidate. This Euskal Kultur Erakundea in Ustaritz has 66 organizations that are a part of it. And so if NEBO creates relations with this organization, we automatically create relations with 66 other organizations that are promoting Basque language, music, culture, literature, art, etc. in Iparralde. And that's what we need, because currently we have personal relationships. Somebody's got a brother-in-law that lives there, my friend lives there, I still visit, but we need institutional relationships so that it doesn't depend on a person, and that it's something that is ongoing and that is consistent. So when we talk about the Basque government in general, we've got three. We can't talk about the Basque government. We have to say the Basque governments. And hopefully there will be something else in Iparralde, and there would be a Basque department that we can have relations with, that we can help them, they can help us, and we create more exchange so that we complete that Basque identity, and that it's not only a certain kind or a certain way that we define a Basque identity. In Euskadi, because they've got the funding for it, then most of our relations currently are with that Basque government, and these are their offices in Gasteiz. They've passed various regulations dealing with interactions with the Basque diaspora and how those should be done. And their goals are these: to strengthen, really, all those relations in any way that they can, and project a current image of the Basque country. Not a 1920s image, not a chistu playing, beret wearing, eating chorizo identity. And not that there's anything wrong with that either. That's my father. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of that. We can't just change everything from morning to night. And we can't have an identity tomorrow unless we had an identity yesterday. And so we have to be just as proud as our identity from yesterday as we are of who we are today and what we're constructing for tomorrow. I'm so happy to see these mothers here with their kids, and that this is a part of something that they wouldn't think of, oh, I'll just get a babysitter and I'll go myself. So happy to see these kids here, so that this is a part of their upbringing, this is a part of their identity, because that's why we're here in the end. We're trying to maintain our past for us today, but for tomorrow as well, for our future. The Basque government has established these world congresses. We just had one now in July in 2003. And so there is a lot of interaction between these delegates and between the countries, which is good. We have people voting in homeland elections. About 33,000 people that are registered to vote in the elections just in Euskadi. But then about 10,552, about 32% actually do vote on election day, but they are participating. So we do have people who are living permanently in California who are then voting in the elections in the Basque country. They have implementation for how they're going to create these relations with these Basque centers around the world, and it basically follows a very simple structure where the diaspora participates and the Basque government participates, and together they create 4-year plans. That's what they call them, these 4-year plans of institutional action. And in those 4-year plans, they decide, what do we need in the next 4 years, and how are we going to accomplish it? And so it's an ongoing process. So I'm going to end with the idea of identity, and that Basque identity in the diaspora is not homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous. It depends on when people immigrated and to where they immigrated, and if the waves of people that came include political exiles or economic exiles or both. It depends on what kinds of relations they had with the Basque government during the time of the Civil War, the Basque government in exile. It depends on if they had political exiles in their communities or if they're just joining the party now. And there's some of the new clubs that we welcome. We have a representative here today from Louisiana who will be forming a new club. We have another representative here today from Denver, Colorado who will be forming a new club. And we encourage that. And that's what we want, is for people to be able to practice their Basqueness in any way that they choose to. I'm not going to have someone tell me that I have to be a postmodern something or other, super modern Basque. No, I kind of like my dad in his beret. I kind of like that old stuff, actually. I prefer the traditional. I'll go to the new stuff, but I prefer the traditional. And that's what I need for me. But for other people, they'll need something more modern. They'll need something different. And that's fine too. So each person is going to have to define their Basqueness in any way that they choose. And we have incredible options now. And the Basque Educational Organization is another one of them. Another place where you can go for information, where you can go for discussion, where you can go and discuss different things. So I'm going to end it there, and thank you for coming today.